Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Parents are willing to do anything for their children's health. Óscar was no exception. He had already lost his beloved wife. Now, his son Manuel, aged 16, was dying from a similar disease. For 2 years, the boy had suffered from a skin condition. Initially, it was a minor rash that he managed with a special cream. But after his mother's death, the situation worsened. The previous treatment was ineffective. Óscar was driven to despair. He couldn't fathom that a mysterious illness would take away everyone he loved. Marina, his wife, had suffered from this affliction her entire conscious life. Each year, her condition worsened. First, more and more parts of her body were affected, then the rash evolved into ulcers. Óscar took her to various doctors. First, they visited the best dermatologists of the country, then went abroad. All the doctors unanimously stated that skin diseases are among the least understood. Moreover, most of them are chronic. No one could cure Marina, they could only slightly alleviate her condition. But the problem was that her body grew accustomed to the medications, and over time, they stopped working. Marina's last exacerbation was very severe. She cried at night from pain, the incessant itching made normal life impossible. Her condition worsened when an infection entered one of the ulcers. With her weakened immune system, Marina rapidly lost strength. Only a week after the infection was discovered, she was finally prescribed treatment. Óscar planned to transfer her abroad, but it was too late. She died the morning she was supposed to fly to the foreign clinic. This situation deeply impacted Óscar's morale. He blamed himself for not arranging her transfer earlier and for not protecting her. Doctors had many theories about the origin of Marina's disease. Most agreed that some stressful event triggered her severe deterioration. Indeed, Marina had one problem that even led her to depression. Her mother opposed her marriage to Óscar, warning that one cannot trust wealthy men. She feared he would play with her daughter and leave her with nothing. Marina's mother wanted her to marry an ordinary clerk with a predictable life. In her opinion, big money couldn't be earned through honest work. She suspected Óscar was a criminal with many enemies and refused to meet her son-in-law or accept their child. Marina didn't listen to her mother. They became estranged for many years, not communicating at all. Marina learned about her mother's death from her brother, with whom she barely kept in touch, as he sided with their mother. They had quarreled since childhood because he always complained to their mother about Marina being the favorite child. He only told Marina about their mother's death after the funeral. She despised him even more for this act, and herself too. It was after this news that her disease flared up, and it was a flare-up she could not survive. Unlike his mother, Marina always accepted every decision of her son. She indulged his every whim from birth. The bond between mother and Manuel was strong, so the boy couldn't help but suffer after her death. The day after her funeral, Óscar noticed a small spot on his son's back, very reminiscent of the rash that covered Marina's body. Óscar immediately took the boy to the doctor, and his suspicions were confirmed. The diagnosis for Manuel was the same as for his mother. Óscar feared that his son might face the same fate as Marina. He didn't waste time and immediately took his son abroad. Surprisingly, in a different climate, the boy felt better. The rash significantly reduced. Óscar considered moving, but he couldn't leave his homeland. He had a business that couldn't be managed from a distance. And Manuel was still in school. He wouldn't be able to study in a foreign language, and they had already lost a lot of time while undergoing treatment. When father and son returned to homeland, Manuel's condition almost immediately worsened. His disease developed somewhat differently. The rash spread to mucous membranes, complicating the boy's treatment. Is there really no cure for this curse? Antonio, Óscar's best friend and business partner, wondered. I'm surprised myself. We've been everywhere, his friend replied. Even the most renowned clinics in the world say that such diseases are poorly understood. The recommendations are the same everywhere: less stress, fresh air, and constant therapy that only alleviates symptoms, not the cause. Óscar explained that the only way to keep his son's condition more or less stable was to live near the sea or forest, where the child could breathe fresh air. But he couldn't afford to live in another country, not for financial reasons, but because it was too far away. And Manuel refused to live abroad due to frequent absences from school and not being strong in foreign languages. There are seas and pines not only in foreign resorts, Antonio said. Why only consider such places? If you move to a city on our coast, you won't disrupt your business too much. And your Manuel won't have problems with a language barrier. Óscar thought about it. Somehow, he had indeed forgotten that it was possible to find a place to live with a suitable climate in their homeland. I'm afraid it will be a new challenge for Manuel's psyche. The more stress he has in his life, the worse his condition gets, Óscar replied. What stress is that? Antonio laughed at his friend. You'll be living by the sea, you can find a house near the forest. New friends, maybe girls. I think it will benefit him. Óscar decided that the idea made sense. Maybe it really was a way out of the situation. He just needed to consult with Manuel. Without his son's consent, he wouldn't do anything. While Óscar was driving home, he once again plunged into memories of his family life. Marina also always dreamed of living by the sea. But for some reason, they never talked about moving. Perhaps it could have saved her life, or at least made her existence easier. Manuel lay in front of the television. Last years, the boy had been doing nothing but playing video games or watching TV shows. He had lost all interest in life. He didn't want to meet with friends because the rash on his face and body constantly raised many questions. Manuel didn't even want to go outside. In public places, people shied away from him, trying to sit as far as possible, while children pointed fingers. In general, only at home could he feel safe. When his father suggested moving to a resort town, Manuel said he didn't care. What difference does it make where to lie in front of the TV? The boy replied indifferently. He was breathing very heavily. Every word was a huge effort. Óscar couldn't look at his son without tears. But he knew Manuel didn't like it, so he tried to hold back. Óscar repeated that he wouldn't make a decision until he knew his son's opinion, to which Manuel again said he didn't care. But you felt better when we went to the sea, didn't you? Óscar tried to influence his son again. Yes, it was better. Maybe there's some sense in your suggestion, the boy replied. But I want you to transfer me to homeschooling. Let that be my condition. I want teachers to come to me for lessons. Óscar nodded silently. He understood that it wasn't a whim or caprice of his son. It was indeed difficult for him to appear in front of classmates. Every trip to school was a trial. After all, children are very cruel. Every student, from first graders to seniors, looked at Manuel with disgust. Sometimes they wouldn't even let him into the cafeteria, considering him contagious. Of course, this created additional stress. The man began to prepare for the move, handling school paperwork to change his son's form of education and completely transferring his work duties to Antonio. Óscar could now only work remotely. Are you leaving forever? Antonio asked his friend. I don't know. First, we'll live there for 6 months, see how things go, Óscar replied. But if I'm needed for work, I'll fly back at the first call. Antonio said he'd try to bother his friend less. He looked quite pleased. Now he was the main boss. Óscar even joked with him, wasn't he purposely trying to send his friend away? Manuel packed his things without much enthusiasm. Every movement caused sharp pain. The skin on the bends of his arms and legs had cracked. The boy couldn't even clench his fist without experiencing acute pain. Eventually, Óscar sent his son to rest, calling the governess to help him. While they were packing suitcases, the man asked if anyone from the staff would go with them. The woman replied that no one from the service staff planned to follow their boss. After all, people here have families. But if Óscar is willing to provide each of them with housing, they would gladly follow him. Óscar laughed and shook his head. The man faced a problem again. The governess looked after Manuel while Óscar was at work or traveling for personal matters. The boy needed injections every 3 hours and constant body treatment with ointments. He couldn't cope with this task alone. So, in the new city, he would have to hire new people. Óscar found a magnificent house. Indeed, there was a forest and the sea nearby. Even Manuel brightened up a bit when he saw the place where they would now live with his father. Both father and son got out of the car, took a deep breath of fresh air, and smiled at each other. "I think this was the right decision," said Óscar, putting his hand on his son's shoulder. "Maybe," was all Manuel replied. The boy closed his eyes and smiled. At that moment, Óscar understood that he had done everything right. Although his son was not yet showing his emotions, the man noticed that he was happy. For the first few months, the father wanted to spend more time with Manuel. Antonio was handling business matters, so there was no need to worry about work. Besides, there was no one here to help the young man, and he couldn't be left alone for long. Father and son had been living in their new place for a week. Manuel's condition had improved slightly. But the changes were minor, with the itching subsiding a bit. No one expected all the sores to heal in just a couple of days. Óscar was well aware that the disease would not retreat so easily. Manuel still refused to go outside. Only on the first evening did he accompany his father when he wanted to stroll along the coast. After that, the boy didn't go outside anymore. He lay down on the sofa in front of the TV again, occasionally opening his laptop to take a distance learning lesson. Despite Óscar wanted to spend more time with his son, it just wasn't happening. The man got bogged down in work again. Even in the new place, he was seeking useful connections. He had many business acquaintances. As soon as the local oligarchs learned about his move, they inundated Óscar with offers. Manuel was left home alone. His father hired nurses from nearby clinics to administer injections. But there was still a desire for a permanent person to ensure the boy was not left unattended. Óscar conducted interviews for caregivers almost every day, but Manuel rejected all options. He either felt that a woman looked at him with disgust or thought the prospective caregiver's face was too mean. Every time, the young man found reasons to refuse. One day, Óscar decided to seek solitude on the seashore to reflect on the events of the last few years of his life. How had he managed to maintain a positive mindset, faith in a miracle? After his wife's death, he hadn't even had time to grieve. Manuel's declining health didn't allow him to relax. Now the man was at an impasse. He didn't understand how to rouse his son, to fill his consciousness with some optimism. Óscar looked at the waves and asked them for an answer. But the sea couldn't tell him anything. "I've never seen a man cry before," a thin female voice said to the left of Óscar. The man startled in surprise. He hadn't noticed that he had been sitting there not alone for a long time. Due to the noise of the surf, he hadn't heard the quiet steps of the girl. She appeared to be no older than 15 years old. She was a gypsy. Óscar looked her up and down. For some reason, he wanted to talk to her, even though he had always been dismissive of representatives of such social classes. "Have you been sitting here long?" he asked. "I heard you asking some Marina why she left you," the girl answered. The gypsy introduced herself as Elsa and extended her hand. Óscar also stated his name but did not respond to the handshake, pretending he didn't notice her palm. Elsa was not offended. She quickly withdrew her hands and asked, "Who is Marina?" "She was my wife," answered Óscar. "And she's dead?" guessed the gypsy. "If you're planning to tell my fortune, don't bother," replied Óscar. "I'm not impressed by such things." "I could tell your fortune, of course," Elsa said somewhat offendedly. "But I'm tired of people's attitudes. Everyone sees me either as a thief or a fortune teller." Óscar felt a bit awkward. He hadn't shaken her hand because he was afraid of being robbed. He first noticed her ethnicity and then her sad eyes. It was obvious she came to the shore to brood or perhaps to dream. Something troubled her soul, and for some reason Óscar wanted to know the source of her distress. Elsa confessed that she had suffered from prejudice all her life. She had no friends and didn't communicate with her brothers and sisters. Her family considered her an outcast, pressuring her to marry. It's customary among her people to start families early, but she didn't want to follow the traditions, trying to convince her parents that people don't live like that in modern society. Elsa dreamt of getting an education, but she needed money which she didn't have. Nobody wanted to hire a gypsy, not even as a cleaner. Óscar felt sorry for her. He had heard of some gypsy customs and often saw children begging with their mothers instead of being in school. Elsa had barely finished school. Now, she couldn't get into college due to her lack of knowledge for the entrance exam, nor could she find a job. She was still a minor and, indeed, no one wanted to work with a gypsy. "I can provide you with a job," Óscar unexpectedly said. "But not right now." Elsa's eyes lit up. She looked at the man hopefully. For the first time in her life, someone listened to her and even offered help. "I'll need to leave in 2 weeks," Óscar continued. "My son is ill and needs constant care. I can't bring him along, so your help would be useful." Elsa smiled broadly and nodded her head. Even Óscar couldn't help but smile when he saw such genuine joy. Something about this girl attracted him. He believed her. "I know how to take care of the sick. My grandmother was bedridden, and I took care of her," the girl said. Óscar explained that his son's illness was different. He could take care of himself, but needed injections and wound treatment. "I want to warn you right away, his condition looks very repulsive," said Óscar. "As for a girl, it might be unpleasant for you to look at him or touch him. But I assure you, it's not contagious. Manuel is very self-conscious about this. He hides from everyone because he's tired of people's disgusted looks." "That's not a problem at all," Elsa said, waving her hand. "Who better than me is used to prejudice and suspicious glances?" Óscar suggested that Elsa come for a few hours to get acquainted and get used to each other. He also needed to teach her how to give injections. Somehow, Óscar thought his son wouldn't mind such a caregiver. After all, they were the same age. One day, Manuel and Elsa's acquaintance went smoothly. Initially, Manuel looked displeased at Óscar, self-conscious about his appearance. But Elsa quickly eased the awkwardness by asking about his interests, games he liked, and shows he watched. Eagerly, Manuel shared his hobbies, and they struck up a conversation. Óscar watched them from a distance, happy to see Manuel interacting with someone in person instead of online friends. On her first day, Elsa successfully gave Manuel an injection, doing it so painlessly that he asked her to always handle it, comparing with the way his father gave him injections. Both Elsa and Manuel lacked real-life interactions, which was evident. Manuel didn't worry about his skin condition with her, and Elsa never looked at him with disgust. She was also pleased that no one hid valuables from her in the house and began saving her salary for education. However, Elsa's involvement with a wealthy man's household caught attention in her community. A brother followed her and reported to their father, Artur, the baron of the gypsy camp. Rumors spread that Elsa was entering a rich home to steal, not sharing with her father. Elsa tried to explain that she was visiting a school friend who was seriously ill, but her younger brother found her book with the saved money, angering Artur. "I forbid you to leave the house," Artur yelled. "Tomorrow, you'll marry the man I've chosen." "No, Dad," Elsa pleaded. "Manuel is very sick, he needs daily injections, and his father will soon leave. I can't abandon him." Artur's face changed from anger to slyness, clearly scheming. He paced, stroking his beard, making everyone silent with anticipation. Elsa knew her father's look meant no good, especially when he saw an opportunity for quick wealth. As she feared, Artur allowed her to continue caring for Manuel until Óscar left, planning to use Manuel's trust in Elsa for his benefit. He instructed her to steal valuable items from the rich man's house. "But he will know it was me," Elsa feared. "We'll deal with that later. For now, do as I say," Artur snapped. "Or get married tomorrow and leave for another family." Elsa wept bitterly, covering her face with her hands, and nodded in agreement. The girl had no intention of robbing anyone. There was still a week left before Óscar's departure. She hoped to find some solution. Surprisingly, after Elsa's arrival in Manuel's life, his condition improved significantly. The father noticed that his son no longer woke up at night from terrible itching, and even the sores had begun to heal, although his breathing was still labored. Óscar wondered what was contributing to the improvement: nature and fresh air, or interaction with the new friend. It had been a month since Óscar and his son moved, so the man needed to leave for work to check the documentation and make sure everything was in order. He planned his trip for the end of the week. Before that, he decided to prepare everything at home for Manuel to live there alone. The day before his departure, he went to the market to buy more meat and vegetables. Elsa said she knew how to cook, she only needed ingredients. She even made a list for the man. While Óscar was choosing a good piece of meat, he overheard a curious conversation behind him between two boys, around 12 years old, maybe a little younger. When the man turned to look at them, he confirmed they were indeed just naive boys, so they didn't hesitate to speak so loudly, unafraid of being overheard. By the way, they were also gypsy boys. One boy boasted to the other that his sister would soon rob a rich man, and their family would move away from this city. All rich people have security. How will your sister get into his house? One of the boys asked. He lets her into his house himself, the second boy proudly replied. She's that cunning, she even has the keys to his house. Óscar quickly realized they were talking about him. He had recently given Elsa the spare key so she could come in when he wasn't home and Manuel was asleep or didn't hear. His first thought was to find this gypsy girl and hand her over to the police. But he quickly realized that as long as the robbery hadn't happened, no one would arrest her. Then he just wanted to drive the girl away, but feared Manuel would be upset. Elsa was the only person the young man let close to him. So Óscar decided to cancel his trip to his hometown. Antonio had said there were no problems anyway, even insisting there was no need to come. The man returned home. He had already bought the groceries, so he just put the bags on the table and told Elsa to sort them out. He threw the bags so carelessly and expressed his request so angrily that the girl immediately guessed something terrible had happened. The gypsy girl hadn't planned to rob him, but she still hadn't figured out how to tell her father. Elsa just hoped everything would somehow resolve itself. Óscar's hostility was incomprehensible to her. He began to behave differently with her, and he started to monitor her every step. Óscar sent the girl to the pharmacy for medicines, intentionally giving her more money than needed. He wanted to check if she would be honest and return the extra or decide to keep the money for herself. Meanwhile, Manuel called his father for a talk. Óscar didn't expect his son to start a conversation in such a tone. The boy demanded that his father apologize to Elsa for his behavior. She was almost crying when she told me how rudely you treated her today, the son said. Manuel, you don't know her, not everyone can be trusted. The father replied. Honestly, I was even thinking of changing your caregiver. Manuel got angry, insisting he didn't want to see anyone but Elsa. He wished his father would leave soon to stop bothering him and refused to talk further. Since when does my son dictate my actions? Óscar thought, shocked at how quickly Elsa had won Manuel over. He had grown fond of her too, believing her to be kind and honest. Discovering the truth about her was upsetting. Óscar almost convinced himself the overheard conversation wasn't about Elsa, but the coincidences were too many. He decided to cancel his trip, thinking she wouldn't dare steal in his presence. Just after Óscar informed his friend about the cancellation, his phone rang with an unknown number. Usually, he ignored such calls, but he answered automatically, startled by the sudden ring. Hello, is this Senor Ortiz? A woman's voice asked. Óscar confirmed she had reached the right person. I have information about the director of your company, she stated. Excuse me, but I am the director, as far as I remember, Óscar laughed. You shouldn't laugh, the woman replied somewhat reproachfully. From what I know, your directorship is temporary. Antonio has long considered himself the main man, and he wants to get rid of you. Now Óscar found it even more amusing. He trusted Antonio completely, having been friends since university, with Antonio even being his son's godfather. Sonora, if you're from the competitors, you won't succeed. I trust my employees, Óscar said. You're right, I am from your competitors, but currently, I have a personal interest, the woman said. I know you're not coming tomorrow, but I'd advise making an unexpected visit to your friend's office at 2 in the afternoon. Hope you make it in time. She hung up, leaving Óscar baffled. How did she know he changed his plans, and why specify a time? Perhaps there was some truth in her words? If he took the night flight, he could make it by 2. But what about Manuel? Óscar couldn't trust Elsa. While he wouldn't be significantly poorer if she stole some things, the act of theft itself was distasteful. Óscar was not accustomed to leaving deceit and betrayal unpunished. The man urgently bought a ticket for a night flight, but he needed someone to leave his son with. Clearly, he couldn't find a new caregiver in just a few hours, and he also didn't want to leave the gypsy girl unpunished if something disappeared from his house. Then it dawned on him. He had installed video cameras. He did this immediately after buying the house to watch over his son when he was away, and for security reasons. However, he never got around to connecting them. Since Manuel never stayed home alone for long, there wasn't much need for them. He quickly synchronized the device with his tablet. Now Óscar could monitor what was happening in his house at any time and from anywhere in the world. When Elsa returned, the man asked her to stay with Manuel for a few days as he had an urgent business trip. The girl happily agreed, stating she didn't want to return home anyway. Óscar thought to himself that her joy was too obvious. If she really planned to rob him, she wouldn't show such a great mood so blatantly. Can I ask you a question you might not like? Óscar asked unexpectedly. Considering he had been extremely distant and cold with Elsa all day, this seemed strange. But the girl was even glad that the man spoke to her not in a commanding tone. She nodded in agreement. You said you could tell fortunes. Could you predict my future? I'm having some issues at work. I don't even know what to expect, Óscar requested. Elsa was even more surprised. The man didn't seem like someone who believed in predictions. But she decided not to refuse, as she felt he was already upset with her. She asked him to stand in front of a mirror and look straight into his eyes, while she stood beside him, peering into the reflection in his eyes. I'll now look into your future through your eyes. I can't predict events precisely, but I can suggest a general trajectory, Elsa explained. I see deep disappointment in someone. You're looking at them and crying because you trusted them with the most precious thing in your life. Something will be taken from you or someone will attempt to take it. I'm sorry, but all I can see now is negativity in your eyes. Well, it was interesting, Óscar said. Thank you. The man immediately realized what the girl's vision meant. Didn't she understand that it was she he would be disappointed in? Óscar had entrusted her with the most precious thing in his life, his son. He accepted her like his own daughter. Let her into his home. And Elsa was planning to rob him. That was the betrayal. That's how the man interpreted the prediction. But he was surprised that the gypsy calmly told him about it. Because he was sure she was talking about herself. Early in the morning, the man was already back in his hometown. He entered his apartment, and it seemed empty and foreign. There was no one there. Óscar felt such acute loneliness that he became sad. He wanted to sleep a bit more after the flight, but first, he needed to check on Manuel. Both the son and his caregiver were still sleeping soundly. What surprised the man was that Elsa was sleeping in Manuel's room, even though he had allocated a guest bedroom for her. But most importantly, there were no strangers in his house, and no one was taking out all his belongings yet. The man took a shower with a calm mind and lay down to rest for a couple of hours. He woke up exactly 3 minutes before the alarm, coming out of sleep so sharply as if someone had awakened him. He had a terrible dream, in which he was looking into his eyes again. Óscar saw his reflection in the mirror. Only now, His look wasn't mocking, like yesterday, but sad. Just as Elsa had described. As if he was looking at the dearest person who betrayed him. The man took his tablet again to check on his son and the caregiver. Maybe they were robbing him right at this minute? But no. Manuel and Elsa were sitting on the sofa in the living room, watching some show on TV. Óscar thought they were sitting too close to each other. But he shrugged it off. They were friends, after all. There were a little over 50 minutes left until 2 o'clock. It was time to go to the office. Óscar hadn't informed his friend that he was coming. He decided it would be a surprise. He found some leftover coffee in the kitchen, quickly brewed a cup, drank it, and set off. At exactly 2 p.m., Óscar went up to his office. The secretary looked at him in fright. She literally froze, even forgetting to greet her boss. "Maria, don't you recognize me anymore?" The man laughed at her. The secretary shook her head silently. She said nothing. Óscar didn't pay attention to his secretary's strange behavior. She always acted inexplicably. "Is Senor Revuelta in the office?" he asked. Maria again said nothing, just nodded. "But he's not alone," finally spoke Natalia, as Óscar was opening the door to the office. The man himself noticed that Antonio was in the office with visitors. And when he remembered where he had seen this guest, he almost immediately understood everything. "Antonio, have you started collaborating with our competitors?" Óscar asked formally. His friend became visibly nervous. He looked at his visitor, hoping to find help. But the visitor remained silent. He was tense but said nothing. There was some contract on the table. And Óscar didn't wait for an answer. He went straight to the paper. "You can't look at this," Antonio sharply said and snatched the contract from his hands. Óscar noticed a mirror in the office. It wasn't there before. Obviously, his friend had already started imposing his order. Antonio was a terrible narcissist. He couldn't pass a mirror without admiring himself. There was always a mirror in his office, sometimes even more than one. Óscar looked at his reflection and saw that very look that appeared to him in a dream. He immediately understood that Elsa was talking about this disappointment. There it was, the betrayal. His business partner and best friend was conducting some business with competitors. There was another unfamiliar folder on the edge of the table. Óscar knew all his documentation, and he had never seen this before. He never kept important documents on the table, he had a safe for that. Antonio also hid valuable contracts and agreements, so it became clear that this folder was prepared specifically for the meeting. Óscar quickly grabbed the folder and dashed out of the office. Antonio chased after him. The man who came for the meeting just left the office, calmly said goodbye to the secretary, and quickly descended the stairs. Óscar managed to get into an opening elevator. He first pressed the button for the first floor and then stopped. He just needed a couple of minutes to review at least one document to understand what his partner was plotting. It turned out Antonio not only concocted a cunning plan but had already begun its implementation. Money was being laundered through Óscar's company. There were documents proving several more financial crimes. But what was most shocking, each contract bore Óscar's surname. Moreover, there was a signature. Somehow, Antonio managed to forge the handwriting so well that Óscar himself doubted whether he had signed it. Directly from the elevator, Óscar called the police. He came out when the police arrived. He told everything to the investigator and handed over the papers. "Find the best expert who can prove this signature wasn't made by me," Óscar said. "I won't skimp on your reward." Of course, Antonio had already fled the office. He realized his end was near when Óscar locked himself in the elevator. Antonio was not a foolish man and knew that his friend wasn't either. The man immediately started to run, but they found him very quickly. Caught right at the airport. Apparently, Antonio underestimated his friend's capabilities, which were great. It turned out that Antonio wanted to frame Óscar so that he would end up in jail and the entire business would transfer to his hands. He began collaborating with competitors precisely to execute his plan. He wanted to sell the business to them, and with the proceeds, he could live the rest of his life in luxury, wanting for nothing. But his plan was never meant to be. Óscar was so stunned by all this that he didn't immediately remember his son. First the long interrogations, then talks with employees. It turned out everyone was very happy to see their boss. Antonio had already told everyone that they would no longer see Señor Ortiz. He was the boss now. As a boss, he was terrible. Nobody liked Antonio. But everyone remembered Óscar fondly. Suddenly, Óscar remembered that it was an unknown woman who convinced him to come here. He decided he simply had to thank her and meet her in person. How did she know the time and date? Could she also tell fortunes? By the way, Óscar hadn't forgotten about the fortune-telling. So, Elsa saw this betrayal. Of course, he also trusted Antonio with his most valuable possession, his business, his secrets, emotional weaknesses. And his son too. The friend was Manuel's godfather. The woman who warned Óscar about the meeting with the competitor agreed to have dinner with him. While the man was waiting for his companion, he decided to check on his child. She, as a lady should, was already 20 minutes late. Throughout the day, the man hadn't even had a moment to call Manuel. He decided to first check the cameras and then call and warn that he would only return the next day. When the tablet showed the camera footage, Óscar almost dropped the device. He looked closely at the screen to make sure he wasn't mistaken. I don't even know what was worse to see, this or Elsa taking out the last chair from my house, he said aloud. Maybe you could show me? And I'll tell you what's worse, laughed the woman behind Óscar. She was the very woman he had been waiting for, named Dina. She was very attractive and clearly not in need. But her eyes were red and moist, as if she had just wiped away tears before approaching Óscar. After they introduced themselves, Óscar simply turned the screen towards Dina. She leaned closer to the gadget to examine what surprising and unpleasant thing the man had seen. Well, a boy and a girl are kissing, Dina said, shrugging. What's so scary about that? First love, teenage romance. It's wonderful. Maybe it is, Óscar drawled. But the boy is my son, and the girl is his caretaker. She's a gypsy, and I basically found her, you might say, on the street. Dina laughed, and Óscar also smiled. He was relieved not to see his own house robbed, and he would deal with his son's love life later. Now all his attention was on Dina. He asked her who she was, how she knew about the deal, and why she warned him. Let's start from the beginning, Dina replied in the same serious tone. My surname is Carrasco. I think you'll understand who I am. And no, not just someone with the same name. Óscar immediately guessed who was sitting before him. There were rumors about this woman's beauty in social circles. Girls envied her, and men regretted that she was already married. Her husband was Sergio Montero Carrasco, the very man who had been negotiating with Antonio earlier that day. He was Óscar's direct business competitor and, as it turned out, had conspired with his best friend to sink him. Then I have another question, said Óscar, realizing who he was dealing with. Why did you disrupt their deal? If it had worked out, you and your husband would have moved up a few places on the list of the wealthiest people. That's just it, my husband's fortune hardly concerns me anymore, Dina sighed. He's been unfaithful. When I found out, he didn't even try to hide it. He just said he has mistresses. More than 2. And that I've become old and uninteresting to him. Óscar was surprised. Before him sat a beautiful young woman. The rumors about her beauty were not exaggerated. He never understood men who don't appreciate what they have, trading it for young girls who only want their money. Dina shared that her husband was planning to divorce her and leave her with nothing. She had never been wealthy, just married well. She couldn't sue for anything because standing up to her husband was impossible. He had connections and means, while she only had herself. I accidentally overheard his conversation with your friend. They met at our house, Dina explained. Right then, I came up with a plan for revenge. But if I had known that Sergio would also end up in jail, I would have called you much earlier. I think this is the perfect revenge. Yes, I'll still get nothing. But at least I'll know that he will be left with nothing too. All his accounts are frozen. I believe the investigation will uncover another case of illegal enrichment. As far as I know, your husband has fled, Óscar interrupted the woman. Apparently, you paid the police quite well, because they arrested him a long time ago, Dina said. So now I'm homeless, but very happy. Óscar shook his head and clapped his hands. He was impressed by the cunning of this woman. One could say, he even admired her resourcefulness. Hats off to you, he said. It takes extraordinary mental abilities to come up with such a plan. But where will you live now? Don't worry, I'll rent a hotel room, Dina answered. As soon as I realized that my dear husband wanted to leave me with nothing, and that he would soon get himself into deep trouble, I withdrew a decent amount from my cards. I think it'll be enough for a while. Óscar speculated that the husband might guess that his wife facilitated his arrest and might seek revenge. He offered her to stay with him. I would like to invite you to my place. I have a house by the sea, there's plenty of space. We may not even see each other, Óscar said. It will be good for you to change your surroundings, breathe some fresh air, and you'll save money too. Dina gladly accepted. Even too easily, Óscar thought, as he didn't have to persuade her much. Don't think that I'm frivolous. It's just easier to endure sadness in company, Dina said. Soon my euphoria from revenge will pass, and I'll have to face the harsh reality where I am an unemployed divorcee. I never thought that, Óscar reassured her. And don't think that I invite every smiling woman to my home. I'm also going through a difficult time. And I don't know what to do about my son now. His love affair is very ill-timed. So it turned out that Óscar was not returning to Manuel alone. He called his son and told him he would be home in the morning. He didn't mention the kiss with Elsa, so his son wouldn't suspect he was being watched. Manuel pleased his father with the news that he was feeling much better. Where's your friend? I can't hear her voice, Óscar asked. Elsa went to get injections. You didn't say you'd be away for a few days. The medicine ran out, his son replied. Óscar said he had a bad feeling, but Dina calmed the new acquaintance. She had no children, but she guessed that parents always worry about their little ones. He said he's feeling better, Óscar shared. In 3 years since Marina's death and the exacerbation of his illness, there was never any improvement. I can't imagine what helped him this time. The sea air? Love works miracles, Dina said. Your son fell in love, and that's why his illness is receding. Of course, the man didn't believe it. They don't live in a fairy tale where any ailment disappears after a kiss of love. But who knows, maybe his son was finally calm and happy, so his body started fighting the deadly rash and ulcers all over his body. Óscar and Dina were approaching the house by taxi. When Óscar saw his house, he began to doubt whether he had given the driver the right address. And you said you live alone, Dina stretched, closely examining the crowd near the fence. Look at all the guests you have. Óscar was shocked. In front of his house stood an entire camp of gypsies, and their mood was anything but friendly. Little children were throwing stones over the fence, obviously trying to hit a window. Women were shouting loudly, men stood calmly, but their faces were unfriendly. As Óscar and Dina got out of the car, snippets of phrases reached them. They didn't understand the language these people spoke, but occasionally they could make out swear words in their native speech. I think we better go around this crowd and enter through the backyard, Óscar suggested. Luckily, there was no one behind the house, and the pair could enter. When the father opened the door, he immediately found his son holding Elsa in his arms. The girl was trembling with fear and crying. She was so frightened that, seeing Óscar, she almost ran away. What's wrong? He's my father, Manuel told her. Surely he's in cahoots with my dad and now will hand me over to be torn apart by that crowd. Elsa screamed and again tried to break free from Manuel. Óscar stopped her himself. He looked into the gypsy girl's eyes and saw genuine fear and horror. The man asked her to tell what happened and why these people were cursing the unfortunate girl. Elsa struggled to catch her breath to utter a word. But tears choked her, she couldn't say a single phrase. Then Manuel himself told his father everything. "We love each other," the boy proudly declared. Dina smiled and looked at the young man with respect. Even Óscar was pleased that his son didn't hide the truth from him and took responsibility for himself and his beloved. "To be honest, I already know about it. But what did you do to these people?" "That's my camp where I live." Elsa finally pulled herself together and decided to tell everything. "My annoying little brother saw us walking on the shore. He immediately told everything to Dad. He became furious that I'm dating a non-gypsy boy. He had already found me a fiancé and was planning to marry me off after the case was over." Elsa cried bitterly again, ashamed to tell what her family demanded of her. But Óscar said he held no grudge against the girl. However, he couldn't help her until he knew the truth. Dina was moved by Elsa's sincere tears. She didn't know about the laws of gypsy life, but assumed it wasn't easy for them. Dina hugged the girl, pressing her close so she could feel safe. Manuel looked questioningly at his father. He had never seen this woman with him before. Óscar waved his hand as if to say he would explain later. Now, they had to deal with the gypsy camp about to break into the house. Elsa finally found the strength to tell what was happening. The camp was urging her to rob Óscar. The man admitted he suspected something like that. Of course, Elsa didn't want to steal, so she stopped coming home altogether. No one looked for her until the boy saw her with Manuel. If her father gets to her, marriage is not the worst thing that could happen to her. "Dad, we need to save Elsa," Manuel pleaded urgently. "I'm afraid we might need to save ourselves too, right?" Óscar asked Elsa. "Your father will want revenge on us as well." Elsa nodded. She wasn't exactly sure it was possible, but didn't rule it out. Óscar approached Dina for a talk. "Sorry, I wanted to support you, and I ended up dragging you into some unclear adventure," Óscar said. "Stop it, it's not your fault." "What kind of wild people are they?" Dina said. "And the girl needs to be saved. If you don't do it, your son will never forgive you." Óscar agreed, but wanted to help Elsa not just because of Manuel. In the month that the gypsy girl looked after his son, the man had grown fond of her. She was a wonderful person. He even felt ashamed for suspecting her of theft. The man called the police, reporting an attack by a mob of enraged gypsies on his house. He ordered Manuel to gather things and documents. Óscar asked Elsa if she was against moving. For now, they would go to his hometown and then think about what to do next. Of course, the girl agreed to anything, just to get away from there. Óscar didn't even get a chance to ask Dina. She immediately declared that she liked this adventure and didn't want to abandon her new friends. The group left through the backyard while the police dealt with the camp. It turned out these people weren't easily scared by the police. A whole scuffle broke out on the street. But neither Óscar, Elsa, nor anyone else found out how it all ended. Elsa faced a new problem. She didn't have documents, so she couldn't fly on a plane or leave by train. But again, Óscar had a solution. He suggested driving to the city, although the journey would take at least 2 days. No one in the company objected. During the trip, Óscar got to know Dina even better. He was shocked that the former socialite wasn't embarrassed to stop at roadside hotels, didn't fuss about lunch in dubious cafes. Even he sometimes felt uncomfortable. After all, the man was used to a different level of service. But everyone took it as an interesting adventure, a step out of their comfort zone. Elsa also befriended Dina, and Manuel was totally thrilled with his father's new friend. Finally, they reached the house. Elsa didn't expect they would now live in such a luxurious place. Manuel eagerly showed his girlfriend the rooms and yard. Óscar watched all this with a smile. "And you said your son was nearly dead," Dina whispered, sneaking up behind Óscar. "I swear to you, it was so," Óscar said in surprise. Could the miraculous power of love really have worked? With all your money, couldn't you have chartered us a private plane? Dina asked. Well, then we wouldn't have become so close, the man replied and winked. Dina winked back, then playfully nudged the man when she realized what he was hinting at. Their interaction was so easy and friendly, as if they had known each other all their lives. Perhaps this is how kindred spirits find each other. Now they lived together as a foursome in Óscar's house. Manuel's rash had almost gone. It no longer bothered him, although his father suggested moving to another city by the sea. The boy refused. He wanted to finish his school and then go to college. But he also planned to marry Elsa when they both turned 18. Elsa turned out to be an excellent housekeeper, taking on all the household chores. She wanted to thank Óscar for his help. She never found out whether her parents were looking for her. Most likely, they disowned her as a traitor. Elsa had heard such stories before when children didn't want to obey their parents and follow traditions and simply ran away from home. She never thought she would become part of such a story. Elsa always believed she wouldn't have the courage. But, of course, without Manuel and his father, she wouldn't have managed. Dina never left Óscar's house either. Not because she had nowhere to go. They started a romance. On the road, the man realized he couldn't let this woman go. She had an incredible sense of humor and supported everyone. Dina was a very kind woman. Her external beauty was a full reflection of her wonderful inner world. Óscar captivated Dina with his manliness and decisiveness. The way he dealt with Elsa earned the woman's respect. She knew she couldn't expect betrayal from such a person. She understood this immediately. While Antonio and Dina's ex-husband were in jail for their crimes, Óscar and Dina were building a new family filled with kindness, love, and harmony.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.